Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? My name's Jack,
I'm Nat.
and today Nat is going to be talking about the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah?
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine. I'm super excited because, okay, so the two of us are studying for the Foreign Service Officer test, but like we really don't talk about it as often. But you can't talk about the history of U.S. foreign policy without talking about the Monroe Doctrine because it's arguably like the most influential piece of U.S. foreign policy in our history. So I'm super excited to talk about it. We're going to start off by flashing back to the early 1820s. And at this time, several Latin American countries had won their independence from either Spain or Portugal. So in 1812, the US had recognized the new nations of Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and Peru. But both the US and Britain were worried that like other European nations were going to come in and colonize these countries later in the future. And they were especially worried about Russia because in 1821, Russian Tsar Alexander I had claimed sovereignty over territory in the Pacific Northwest. So that ranged from like Alaska to the Oregon Territory, and he banned foreign ships from approaching the coast. And America was like, what the heck? And so they were like really worried that all these European nations were going to come and grab all this territory that the US was trying to grab, right? And so President James Monroe, he's president at the time, and he is scared of foreign intervention in the Americas. And he wanted to create a joint US British resolution that would ban further colonization in Latin America by other European powers. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, he goes to President Monroe and he's like, hey, let's ditch Britain because it would actually limit future opportunities for the US to expand its territory if we collaborated with Britain. And then also, like, Britain might decide to colonize these territories or these countries in the region. And so John Quincy Adams, he was like really focused on trade in Latin America, South America. And he thought that like European trade was the greatest obstacle in the US's economic expansion. And so he didn't want anything to do with Britain. And so he convinces President Monroe to draft a statement of unilateral US policy that would establish the US as the protector of the entire Western Hemisphere. So on December 2nd, 1823, President Monroe gives his annual speech to Congress, and in it, he explains the idea of what would later be known as the Monroe Doctrine, even though it was actually like mostly written by John Quincy Adams. And it's only a few paragraphs in his entire speech, but it's so significant. Like it has a lasting effect that we still see today. And so, in a nutshell, the Monroe Doctrine states that the US is the protector of the entire Western Hemisphere and nobody else can touch it. And there are three main concepts in his speech. So, the first is that the old world and the new world were different and should be two distinct spheres of influence. So, remember, like uh, when the pilgrims went to America and they're like, oh, this is the new world. Old world is like all the European countries. So they're like, okay, we're different. Let's not bother each other. The second concept is that European powers couldn't colonize Latin America. And the third is the concept of non-interference. And so any attempt by a European power to exert its influence in the Western Hemisphere would be seen as a threat to US security. And so in turn, the US wouldn't interfere in the political affairs of Europe or with existing European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So does that make sense?
Yeah. So when you like the Monroe Doctrine, is it just we're signing it, or do we have to get Europe to sign it too?
We're like literally no one's even signing it. That's the thing. It's
Oh,
saying it. He's literally just like he gives a speech and he's like, "Hey, this is a thing now. Like the US, we're the protector of the Western Hemisphere, and if Europe tries to come in, like that's going to be a threat to us, and so we're going to fight you.
Okay, so no one acknowledged it, just like president said it. Yeah, that's it.
He's like, he just declared it, like, which, yeah. So obviously, like, this is pretty insane because at the time, the U.S. is like a really young country, and it's a very minor player on the world stage, and also it has like no military or naval power to back this up. Like, he's just saying it, but at,
Yeah, because this is 1812, right? Is that what you said? Okay.
oh, sorry, no, 1823.
Okay.
So yeah, so this is after the War of 1812. So I think we were kind of feeling cocky at the time.
Oh, yeah. For no good reason, because if you watched War of 1812, you know how that went down.
Yeah, it wasn't anything to be like super proud of.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so we were like feeling really good about ourselves. But yeah, the rest of the world pretty much ignores President Monroe, and they're like, okay, cool, whatever. No one takes it seriously. And
Question two, I mean, how would everyone else acknowledge it? Because he gives this speech, but then did they distribute it to everyone else? Did they send messengers? Or is it just you said this to some people and like no one else knows about it?
I don't know, like maybe like newspapers reported on it and then like word got sent to other countries. But yeah, I really don't know. You can't just like live stream it like on
Yeah.
Facebook. Like yeah, I don't know how they even.
Can you imagine? It's like a game of telephone, right? If you're trying to like spread the news. And then by the time it gets to like Chile, they're like, who? Who's protecting us?
They're like, wait, those guys? Really? Okay, good.
Is that a nation? Aren't they British? Like,
I
didn't Canada just burn down their White House or something?
like I thought they were done though. Like what the yeah, I'm sure like other countries in Latin America are just like, what? Okay. Yeah, but okay, so then like in 1833, British forces occupy the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina.
I know about this. Yeah. I really want to visit the Falkland Islands.
Yeah. Falkland Islands. Very interesting history. But yeah, so British forces occupy the islands and it's off the coast of Argentina. So it's technically in the US's sphere of influence. But the US decides not to invoke the doctrine, probably because they don't actually have like the military power to stop them. So Britain comes and they take over the islands and the US does nothing. And so people are like, okay, like great job. Uh, however, as time passes and the US's military and economic strength grows, it actually starts to follow through with the Monroe Doctrine. So the first example of this is in 1867. So this is right after the Civil War ended in 1865. And the US has a lot more military power because of the Civil War, right? And so at the time, Mexico is being ruled by Emperor Maximilian, who had been put into power by the French government because Mexico owed France a lot of debt. So they're like, okay, we're going to put this guy in charge of you. Um, and the US, they don't like that France has so much influence in their neighboring countries' politics. And so they decide to provide military and diplomatic support to Benito Juarez, who is the president of the Mexican Republic. And Emperor Maximilian is executed on the orders of Benito Juarez. So that's like a big deal that, yeah, we supported that and helped make that happen. And so that kind of like, not only does that like solidify our commitment to the Monroe Doctrine, but it shows that, hey, we actually have the power to follow through with this
Yeah.
declaration.
I'm always confused on the US's relation with France. Like I need a timeline of do we like them? Do we not like them? Because we're allies at one point for the American Revolution and now we're not. Now we're trying to make sure that they don't expand territory. It's
Yeah, I also am like very confused about that. Also, I just watched Hamilton on Disney Plus, and so like yeah, there's like Lafayette, and like he's a good guy, but then I don't know, now we don't like France, and so yeah.
I feel like we always liked France though. We love our French viewers. But Like, I feel like, because even or when they had the revolution, we still were like Thomas Jefferson is like lobbying for us to still like send funds and like help France out in their revolution, and then we decide not to.
Yeah, you know what? I think like the root of the problem isn't like whether or not we like France right now. It's just like we don't want them to have influence in the region. Sorry, I have like something in my eye. Yeah, I just think we don't want them to have influence like on Mexico's politics just because we want the whole hemisphere to ourselves. We're not
Uh
greedy at all. We're like
yeah, it's not about them. It's like it's not you, it's me. Like
to
it's
me,
not that we don't like you.
yeah, we want all of this to ourselves without yeah, without any pushback. So yeah, I think that's what it is, but I don't know. France, yeah. Shout out to our French viewers, but yeah, so after this, um, the US is propelled by Manifest Destiny and it continues to expand its influence all around the world. So we see America is acquiring a bunch of overseas territory from the Spanish American War, which we'll cover soon, hopefully, and then also in the Pacific Islands. And this helps solidify the US's role as a world power. And it also gives like the necessary strength again to back up this doctrine. So we're just like acquiring land and we're like, yes, we are like it, we are a major world player. And like what the big changing point is in 1904 when European creditors were threatening to send in armed forces to Latin American countries who hadn't paid back their debt yet. And so President Theodore Roosevelt, he steps in and he sends US Marines to Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic in order to ward off these European creditors. And he says, quote, in the Western Hemisphere, the adherents of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power, unquote. And so,
That's
yeah, yeah.
oh, go ahead. I was gonna say that's really interesting because I've been like doing some research on the Haiti Revolution. And so with Haiti's revolution and them owing debts to France, which were ridiculous, we'll talk about it in another episode. But it's interesting that the Monroe Doctrine had them maybe defend like Haiti and these like other Central American countries when a lot of these countries were refusing to do trade with Haiti because of that revolution.
Oh,
Thoughts on that?
that's interesting. Yeah, okay. Honestly, I don't know too much about the Haitian Revolution, so I'm really excited to learn more about that in a future episode. But yeah, and also like just like overall with this whole like, oh, you can't colonize Latin America, like I not to be like super cynical, but I don't think it's like out of like reasons of like, oh, we have a pure heart, like we don't want you to be colonized. I think it's just we don't want European powers influence in our quote unquote backyard. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it has to do with our relation with Haiti too. It's like, yeah, we're not gonna let these debtors come in, but not because we're like
Yeah, not because we like you guys, but it's
because we don't want them having power near us. So I think, yeah, that's where this gets tricky and yeah, but like regardless, like this like Theodore Roosevelt literally says we're the international police power of the Western Hemisphere, which is a huge deal. And like his whole viewpoint, his whole foreign policy theory, I guess, would later be known as the big stick policy because he has this famous slogan towards foreign policy: speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far. So this basically means that like, hey, let's focus on negotiation and cooperation, but also like don't forget we have all this military power and we're really not afraid to use it against you if we need to. So that's kind of what the big stick policy is. And actually, like in his speech, he tells the audience, remember, the Monroe Doctrine will be respected as long as we have a first class Navy. So he's really like adamant, like President Roosevelt is really adamant about expanding US influence all around the world. And yeah, expanding the interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. And so this might seem like common sense today because it's kind of like it's really shaped what our foreign policy strategy looks like today. So we kind of see similar thoughts and theories today. But like this is really crazy at the time because if you think about other empires at the time, like the Spanish Empire, French, British Empire, like their whole theory has kind of just been to like send a bunch of ships and like military power and just like go to war with like all these territories. But then Roosevelt comes in and he's like, okay, yeah, we could send in military power, but it's more about like scaring people and like threatening you through like negotiation. So it's, I don't know, I just thought it's really interesting because it's a pretty big change. And yeah, so obviously Roosevelt expands the interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, and it basically justifies military interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean. Um, so it's a really big deal. But then President, so then if we flash forward to the Cold War, 21st century. Oh, sorry, this is not the Cold War. Okay, scratch that. Okay, so then if we flash forward to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he replaces the big stick policy with the good neighbor policy. And this focuses on cooperation and trade rather than military force in order to improve relations in Latin American countries. And so, for example, the Organization for American States is created in order to strengthen cooperation in the Western Hemisphere, and it still exists today, which is cool. But this does not stop future leaders from using the Monroe Doctrine in order to justify military interventions in the Western Hemisphere. So President John F. Kennedy actually invoked the Monroe Doctrine during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 when he ordered an air and naval quarantine of Cuba after the Soviet Union started building missile launching sites there. And so that's a big deal because again, like if you think about it, like the US really doesn't have the right to like go send I guess forces there and like police things. But because of this Monroe Doctrine, like it really establishes our foreign policy strategy and our role, our perceived role in the region. And because we send the troops to Cuba and have this quarantine there, which basically means like we like blockade it and we're like, hey, no one can come in or out. So after several days of this, the Soviet Union begins to dismantle its sites and withdraw its missiles. So it's effective, it works. Which also like Cuban Missile Crisis, like we should cover that in a future episode.
Oh, definitely.
So after this, after JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis, you rarely hear presidents explicitly use the word Monroe Doctrine to justify their foreign policy decision making. But like even if they're not saying it out loud, the Monroe Doctrine's history and its legacy nonetheless influence their opinions and their perspective of America's role in the region.
So do you know like what the most recent use of the Monroe Doctrine has been? Maybe like an example?
Yeah, so I think, well, that's the thing is like presidents don't really say, like they don't really use the Monroe Doctrine explicitly to justify like what their decision making, and they don't really say like, oh, I'm going to use the Monroe Doctrine, because again it's just a declaration, like it's not really a treaty. So I think JFK was like the last one to say like, hey, like talk about the Monroe Doctrine and be like, this gives us the right and the power to intervene in Cuba's affairs. But like as yeah, but that doesn't mean that like the US has a very long history of intervening in the regional affairs of Latin America. So yeah, so the history of US influence in Latin America is very controversial and pretty polarizing, but I believe that all Americans should be aware of all of our country's history, not just the fun stuff. So I'm going to attempt to give a very, very brief and unbiased overview of the modern history of US influence in the region. And yeah, I'm just going to be presenting facts. So let's start with President Reagan. So President Ronald Reagan sent military aid to El Salvador during his administration. So in the 1980s, a civil war broke out in the country, and the US government sent billions of dollars worth of economic and military aid in order to support the Salvadoran government so they could defeat the leftist forces that were trying to overthrow the government. So they wanted the government to remain in power. They didn't want them to be overthrown. And 75,000 people died in this conflict. So yeah, it's a really significant event. And yeah.
When you say leftist, what does that mean?
Yeah, like politically left. So people label them as like either socialist or communist.
Okay.
Yeah. And so probably one of the most well-known events in President Reagan's foreign policy career was the US's involvement in Nicaragua in what would later be known as the Iran-Contra affair. So have you heard of this before?
No.
Okay. So actually, the Iran-Contra affair is especially controversial. And of course, just a reminder, Jack and I are trying to create an apolitical and unbiased environment. So when we discuss these historical events, so I'm just going to give a very brief overview of facts only. So in Nicaragua, there are anti-communist Contras that are battling the communist government. It's the communist Sandinista government. So it's communist versus anti-communist, like a theme we see a lot through history. And so President Reagan supported the Contras, the anti-communist Contras, and he argued that they were the, quote, moral equivalent of the founding fathers, unquote. And at the time, the Contras received much of their funding from drug trafficking. So, yeah. And across the world in Lebanon, 7 Americans were being held hostage by Iranian-backed terrorists from the group Hezbollah. And so, sorry, this is like there's so many countries involved in this thing, so it's very confusing, and that's why I think a lot of Americans like maybe don't understand it fully. So, yeah, they're in Lebanon, but they're held by Iranian terrorists. And so Iran actually wanted to buy weapons from the US because at this time they're at war with Iraq, so they need weapons for their war. But the US has a trade embargo against Iran, which means they can't do trade with them. And so some national security leaders to President Reagan suggested that an arms deal with Iran would lead to the release of the American hostages in Lebanon and would also improve relations with Lebanon. And furthermore, the funds that the US would receive from this arms deal could be used to support the Contras in Nicaragua. But Congress had just passed legislation that limited the power of the CIA and the Department of Defense in international conflicts. So the CIA would have to funnel this money to Nicaragua secretly. And so there are debates over who knew what was happening, especially whether or not President Reagan knew about the secret funds being sent to Nicaragua. And so that's where I'm just going to leave it at that. You could do further research.
That's really hard to follow. I think I need like a whiteboard drawing.
It's really like I wish I could have it.
Yeah, we need when we get enough income, we will put it into getting animators to draw that out for people.
Yeah, somebody. Oh, that'd be so great. Whew, exciting.
That's the next step. That's my goal. That's my dream for us. Yeah, no, that's like confusing to me.
Basically, like to summarize in one sentence, like the money that was received from this trade deal with Iran, who was kind of like an enemy at the time, was used to support rebel forces in Nicaragua, but that had to be done secretly because it was not technically legal. So
that we didn't support rebel groups in Iran, but we supported rebel groups in Nicaragua. And why did we support the rebel groups in Nicaragua? Because they were
anti-communist and the government was communist.
There it goes. Yeah, so Lebanon, hold on. Why were we even in Lebanon? Why do we have American soldiers that were captive in Lebanon?
They were I think if 4 of them were diplomats and then 3 of them were like contractors. So they were out there like working, building stuff.
Oh, and then they just got taken captive or hostage?
So they're in Lebanon chilling, but then this Iranian terrorist group Hezbollah, they're like in Lebanon and they're like, "Oh, you're Americans, like we're taking you hostage," in order to like leverage for leverage and yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ooh, interesting.
Super complex.
Yeah, I don't even the Middle East conflict, Iran and Iraq, they're in conflict. I don't know what that's about. Yeah.
We could do a whole season just about the Middle East, like honestly, like
Yeah, we should.
complex history. Yeah, but that is a brief summary of the Iran Contra affair. But so like regardless, like despite all this controversy, like the fact is that the U.S. saw themselves as a police power and as a regional watchdog in Latin America. They like saw themselves as like having the power to interfere in Nicaragua's affairs, right? And like even if no one ever said anything about the Monroe Doctrine, like the legacy and the history of our foreign policy in Latin America is like rooted in the Monroe Doctrine. So that's why like it's significant. And then finally, like the last event I want to talk about is on December 20th, 1989, when President George H.W. Bush decided to invade Panama in order to oust the country's military dictator. His name was Manuel Noriega. And he had been indicted in the US on drug trafficking charges. So we're like, hey, we want to arrest you. Like, even though he's like a country's leader, we're like, you're in charge of sending drugs in and out of Panama, and so we're gonna arrest you. So literally, like, the U.S. sent 9,000 troops to meet up with the 12,000 troops that were already stationed in Panama, and they kind of like blockaded Noriega, and eventually he surrendered and he was arrested, and then he was like sent back to the US and he was sentenced to 40 years in US federal prison. And again, like the fact that the whole role as international police power, regional watchdog, rooted in the Monroe Doctrine.
Wow.
The Monroe Doctrine has a very complicated legacy, and it's easy to see how much its interpretation has changed since it was created in the 1800s. At first, it was supposed to prevent European powers from interfering in the Western Hemisphere, but over time, it would be used to support US intervention in the affairs of Latin American countries. So regardless of like whether or not you support the Monroe Doctrine or its interpretation, most people agree that it's one of the most influential policies in US history, and it's had a huge effect in shaping our foreign policy strategy and like what the world looks like today. And it's just so crazy to see how a few paragraphs in a speech given in the 1800s has significantly changed America's role on the world stage and in the region. So yeah, that's basically the Monroe Doctrine. It's wild, and it's so important, especially for people who are looking to take the Foreign Service Officer test or are interested in the history of U.S. foreign policy. Like, this is so significant. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Nat, for breaking that down for us. Really enjoyed it.
Hey, it was fun to talk about.